Hi, I'm Theo, and these broadcasts are to support the blogs on nomorec.com's website as well as the online classes. This episode, part 3 of our Elohim series. Welcome back to another episode of the No More Sea broadcast, where we pick up part 3 of what is Elohim. Now, we have been talking about this phrase, in the beginning God, and we looked at the Hebrew lemma behind this word translated God in Genesis chapter 1 verse 1, and we know it to be the Hebrew lemma Elohim, and we have discussed this in several videos, including a Bible word study, and it would be important for you to catch the context of those other videos. But at the same time, this third part is a bit crucial in understanding what we're trying to do here to make sure that we offer proper clarification. As we open up in the ESV, and this is Logos 9, the first section that scholars deal with when we're talking about the entire section of the creation. And many scholars go so far as to call this Genesis chapter 1, because your chapter numbers come just a few centuries ago, not very long ago. And so this whole entire section is often what scholars note. And if you notice, we're in chapter 1, verse 1, in the beginning God. And it is the beginning, but then the bookend to that is down at the bottom, all the way on the seventh day in chapter 2, where it begins to close things out. So we have nice bookends here. And we talked, in our previous videos about the end from the beginning, and we're taking an entire section of Scripture and trying to understand it. So in this block of text is our main focus, and this phrase, in the beginning God, begins here, and it ends with a similar expression. So we had the beginning, the Genesis, and we have the generations of heaven and earth that were created. And when we focus on the next word, the verb bara, we'll see how it's there in verse 4 of chapter 2, and this nice section that caps everything off. But in that, as God is finishing everything up, we have in chapter 2, verse 1, that the heavens and earth were finished and all the host of them. And so, as God began his story, then God ends it with this phrase, host. And some people have, tried to deal with what that term means. And so we're going to look at that a little bit more in this episode. Thus the heavens and the earth were finished, and all the host of them. In Genesis 2:1 is kind of a bookend where we have, before day 1, and then we get all the way and we're finished, day 7, and then we're kind of wrapping up, and this is the end of the story. And so what does this host mean? We want to look at that. And that term in the Hebrew is savah. And most of the time it refers to military service. And let's get into this terminology a little bit here and how the Bible uses it. Now, as far as Genesis, and especially Genesis 2:1, what does it mean here? Just looking up, the general sense here of what's all encompassed in this word. Only in this pericope, only in this section from Genesis chapter 1, verse 1, all the way into chapter 2, verse 4, and again, verse numbers. Chapter numbers came a few centuries ago, and not even that much later on. After that came the verse numbers, and so there's many verse numbers and chapter numbers that change with different perspectives, like the Hebrew Bible has different numerification, and the Greek translation has different numbers. So, it's very difficult. But as far as what we have inherited in our Christian tradition, and so this is the list of things that is inclusive. And again, I pulled this up from the Bible Word Studying Logos, and this is just simply what's included in that term, host of all the things that are listed in this section, this entire section. Okay, these are the things in mind. So I want to focus in on that. Okay, so our original discussion, we want to frame this. Our original discussion was, in the beginning, God, and God is the subject. And we did a Bible word study, and we've been talking about this word Elohim, and obviously in the Bible itself, the Hebrew Bible, the scriptures that we call often as Christians the Old Testament, the focus with this Hebrew term is, it appears around 2,600 times, depending on which databases you're referring to. And out of those databases, well over 2,300 times it's referring to the Israelite God. And that is the supreme subject. And if you go back to our little tiny video on Yahweh, the divine name, and we talk about how God is sovereign. And so we're going to pick up some of those threads now. As far as the Bible concerned, that the majority of the time, this is the terminology, and this is what the majority of people think the word means, and they are right in that emphasis. All we're trying to do is offer some precision that this word at times doesn't always just mean the God of Israel, capital G-O-D, but other times it refers to something else. And the same thing in this case. The focus primarily in this section, the first rhythm or first story, or the first narrative, the first, it's a lyrical, it's a very poetic, but yet it's still a very, a text that's very much narrative. Is trying to tell the history, the beginning of things. So it's not quite, it's more of a song maybe. It's not just straight out poetry. And so in this, what we have in this beautiful, very strange genre that doesn't appear anywhere else hardly, we have this idea of God. And the focus in this section from chapter 1, verse 1 to chapter 2, verse 4 is basically the realm of earth, the land, Eretz, and those who have been put over in charge of it as his stewards, the earthlings. So you have earth, as Dr. Hamilton, who taught me Pentateuch, as he has it in his commentary. He dwells on this, and I hope to do videos on this some more, and it's a part of my dissertation, the Adamic principle. The connection that there is, that scholars find in the grammar here, in the creation account and in the Bible, is focused more on earth and earthling than anything else. And you'll see that in these passages. And obviously, in our previous studies of Elohim, when you click on the word Elohim, it appears lots of times in this section of our Bibles, and it's always referring to God, G-O-D, capital G-O-D, God, the Israelite God, Yahweh. And he is sovereign. And this passage is concerned not about a lot of things. It's a very precise passage focused very narrowly on a few things. And we bring to this passage so many questions that it does not bother responding to or answering. It doesn't talk about heaven. It doesn't talk about the supernatural world. It doesn't talk about other beings. It doesn't tell us anything about the fall of Satan or any rebellions of divine beings. It's not focused on the creation of angels or other spirits, or it's not talking. Actually, it's not even talking about what's commonly referred to as creation ex nihilo, where the idea and the belief that God's people have, that God created everything out of nothing, that none of that is being discussed in these verses specifically. And there's a lot that's brought into these verses. There's even the gap theory that Schofield is famous for bringing up that's brought to bear in this passage. And a lot of these ideas that just don't fit. And so we need to be careful when we approach this section of the Bible to understand what it's talking about. And yes, for the author of Genesis and his audience, in this section, Elohim only means the Israelite God. And it doesn't discuss other Elohim. So I don't mean to imply that in parts 1 and 2 on the Bible word study. I'm just trying to get a grasp for the entirety of the term as it's used across both testaments and in the literature that surrounds our faith and feeds our traditions and fuels us. And so where do these ideas that we get come from? But Genesis 1 is not this section, chapter 1, verse 1 to chapter 2, verse 4, that many scholars just say, hey, let's just call this Genesis 1 because this should be what chapter 1 is. And whoever made up the chapters did not get them quite right because they were lining their text up for a printing press, one of the first printing presses, because they wanted to print the Bible. And they weren't really paying attention to Hebrew grammar. And we know many of the fathers had difficulty with Hebrew. And so even there's some people like Bart Ehrman who gets the Hebrew wrong at times. But anyway, he's not familiar with Hebrew. But anyway, so in this section, and specifically in this verse, this is pretty much all that's being understood when we use the word host. So generally, the word host outside of this section is involving military service, and we're going to talk a little bit about that in the second half of this presentation. But here, in this verse specifically, the host is just talked about here, and that's the main thing. Now, again, Bruce Waltke has talked about this, including other things, and he's actually done 3 really good articles in journals from Dallas Theological Seminary on the gap theory and why it's wrong. But he also talks about here that host includes the idea of the heavenly host. But Sailhammer pushes back, even Golden Gay pushes back to say, at least in this passage, the focus here is, again, like Hamilton said, on earth and earthling. Most of it's on the land and humans as those who are put in charge of the land. And so that's the focus. We're not, when we use the word heavens, we're not talking about necessarily the idea of heaven where God lives. That's not the focus. So a lot of these topics we bring into the discussion and the dialogue. And so I don't want to imply that Elohim in this section, as per our discussion in part 1 and part 2, applies specifically only to Genesis chapter 1 and all the way into chapter 2, verse 4. I don't mean to imply that. Neither do I mean to imply that the host in chapter 2, verse 1 would apply to anything but what's listed here. These are the things that are a part of what's being discussed and understood as host, interestingly. But I still, want to deal a little bit more with this term and deal with the idea of Elohim and how later on, then, discussions bring in the other Elohim. And, they are mentioned. And so we have to preface our understanding that there are other things that the reader and the writer intend and understand that are background information when we read these. We hope you have enjoyed part 3 of our series on Elohim. Come back for more as we go to part 4 in the next series on Elohim and understanding how this term is used in other parts of the Bible. Thank you very much, and God bless you for listening. Stay tuned for more episodes in videos to help you with your journey from nomorec.com.